Picture Rome in 65 AD. The empire stretched from Britain to Egypt. Wealth flowed like water, and at its centre sat a young emperor who believed he was touched by the gods themselves. But when he lost his temper, everything changed forever. If stories like this fascinate you too, hit like to help more people discover these hidden chapters of history. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus wasn't your typical ruler. While other emperors focused on military campaigns and political strategy, Nero had different passions. He wrote poetry, performed in theatres, and raced chariots. The Roman elite whispered behind closed doors that their emperor cared more about applause than governing. But Nero didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to be loved by it. Every performance, every public appearance was carefully crafted to win the hearts of his people, and for the most part it worked. The crowds cheered when he sang, roared when he raced, and showered him with the adoration he craved. Yet behind the public spectacle lived a man with a dangerous temper, someone who saw himself as equal to the gods of Olympus. This combination of artistic ego and unlimited power would soon create one of history's most disturbing stories. At Nero's side stood Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was legendary throughout the empire. Ancient historians described her as intelligent, ambitious, and strikingly attractive. She wasn't just Nero's wife. She was his closest advisor and perhaps the only person who could influence his decisions. Poppaea's rise to power hadn't been simple. She'd been married before, first to a Praetorian Guard prefect, then to Marcus Otho, who would later become emperor himself. But when Nero saw her, everything changed. He was so captivated that he allegedly orchestrated his first wife's execution just to marry Poppaea. Their relationship was intense and complicated. Poppaea had given birth to their daughter Claudia in 63 AD, though the child tragically died in infancy. Now, in 65 AD, she was pregnant again, carrying what they hoped would be the heir to the empire. But even empresses had limits to their patience. The Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 spectators, and on this particular day in 65 AD, it was packed. Nero had spent the entire day there, not just watching but participating in the races himself. He loved the thunder of hooves, the roar of the crowd, and the intoxicating rush of competition. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and back at the palace, Poppaea waited. This wasn't unusual. Nero often lost track of time when he was performing or competing. But Poppaea was heavily pregnant, feeling unwell, and growing increasingly frustrated with her husband's priorities. The Emperor of Rome was out playing games while she managed the actual business of ruling. When Nero finally returned to the palace that evening, he was still riding high on the day's excitement. He'd won races, heard the crowds chant his name, felt like the god he believed himself to be. What he found at home was a very different energy. Ancient sources tell us that Poppaea confronted Nero about his absence. She was tired, pregnant, and fed up with being treated as less important than chariot races. The exact words exchanged between them are lost to history, but we know the argument escalated quickly. Nero had always had a volatile temper. Throughout his reign, disagreements had a way of turning deadly. His own mother, Agrippina, had learned this the hard way when she tried to control him. Now, Poppaea was discovering that even being the emperor's beloved wife didn't make you safe from his rage. According to the historian Suetonius, what happened next was shocking even by Roman standards. In a fit of anger, Nero allegedly kicked his pregnant wife. The blow was fatal. Both Poppaea and her unborn child died. However, it's important to note that modern historians question this account. The story follows a pattern used to vilify unpopular rulers throughout history. Similar tales were told about other tyrants, suggesting this might be propaganda rather than fact. Some scholars believe Poppaea may have died from complications during childbirth or miscarriage, tragically common occurrences in the ancient world. Whether Nero was responsible for Poppaea's death or not, his reaction revealed the depth of his feelings for her. The emperor was devastated in a way that surprised even his critics. Instead of following Roman tradition and cremating Poppaea's body, Nero ordered something unprecedented. She was embalmed, preserved like the pharaohs of Egypt. This was virtually unheard of in Roman culture, where cremation was the standard practice for everyone, including emperors. Nero went further. He declared Poppaea a goddess, establishing her own religious cult with temples and ceremonies. The funeral was a spectacle unlike anything Rome had seen, with legendary amounts of incense burned in her honor. Some sources claim Nero used more Arabian spices in a single day than the region produced in an entire year. But perhaps most telling was Nero's behavior in the weeks that followed. The man who had shown little genuine emotion when his mother died, who had coldly eliminated his first wife, was now completely broken. He wandered the palace calling Poppaea's name, unable to accept that she was gone. It was during this period of grief that Nero made a decision that would create one of history's most disturbing stories. He couldn't bring Poppaea back, but he became obsessed with the idea of finding a replacement, someone who could fill the void she'd left behind. Nero sent servants throughout the empire with a specific mission: find someone who looked like the dead Empress. The search extended from the streets of Rome to the slave markets of Greece, from noble families to common households. Anyone who bore even a passing resemblance to Poppaea was brought to the emperor's attention. This wasn't just about physical appearance. Nero wanted someone who could walk like her, talk like her, even wear her clothes and jewelry. In his grief-stricken mind, he believed he could somehow recreate what he'd lost. The search led to Greece, where Roman officials scoured markets and households looking for the perfect candidate. And then, in 66 AD, they found him. The young person who caught their attention wasn't a woman at all, but a boy, a slave whose delicate features and striking resemblance to Poppaea were uncanny. Ancient sources don't tell us his real name or background, only that he was extraordinarily beautiful and bore an almost supernatural likeness to the dead Empress. When word reached Nero about this discovery, his response was immediate and chilling. He didn't see the obvious problems with his plan, didn't consider the impossibility of what he was attempting. He saw only a solution to his grief and a way to have Poppaea back. The boy was brought to Rome, likely having no idea what fate awaited him. He was probably told he was being taken to serve in the imperial household, a common enough occurrence that wouldn't have seemed particularly alarming. But Nero had much more than simple service in mind. What Nero proposed was unprecedented in Roman history. He wanted to transform this young slave into a replacement for his dead wife. Not just a companion or a reminder, but an actual substitute empress who could take Poppaea's place in every way possible. The practical challenges of this plan were enormous. Roman society, despite its acceptance of various relationship arrangements, had never seen anything like what Nero was proposing. The political implications alone were staggering. How would the Senate react? What would the people think? How could this possibly work? But Nero wasn't thinking politically or practically. He was thinking with the grief of a man who'd lost everything and the power of someone who believed he could reshape reality to suit his desires. The first step in his plan would require something drastic, something that would change the young slave's life forever. Nero ordered that the boy be castrated, surgically altered so he could play this role Nero had chosen for him. As Chapter 1 closes, we leave Rome in a state of barely controlled chaos. The emperor has made a decision that will shock the ancient world and create ripples that extend far beyond the palace walls. The young slave, still unaware of the full scope of what's planned for him, is about to undergo a transformation unlike anything in recorded history. His name, his identity, his very body, everything will be changed to serve one man's desperate need to undo an irreversible loss. What happens next will challenge every assumption about power, identity, and the lengths to which grief can drive someone. The boy is about to become someone else entirely, whether he wants to or not. And in the halls of the Roman Senate, whispers are already beginning about the emperor's latest obsession, whispers that will eventually grow into the rebellion that brings down the Julio-Claudian dynasty forever. Coming up in Chapter 2, the transformation begins, and Rome watches in horror as their emperor attempts the impossible, turning a slave boy into an empress. The young slave brought to Nero's attention had no way of knowing he was about to become part of one of history's most unusual stories. Ancient sources don't preserve his original name or background. We only know him by the name Nero would give him later, Sporus. What we can piece together suggests he was likely in his teens, possessed of delicate features and an unfortunate resemblance to the dead empress. In the Roman world, beautiful young slaves often served as companions to wealthy households, so his situation wouldn't have seemed immediately dangerous. But this wasn't a typical household, and Nero wasn't a typical master. Nero's plan was unlike anything attempted in Roman history. He wanted to literally replace his dead wife with a living substitute, not just someone to remind him of Poppaea, but someone who could actually become her. The challenges were staggering. Roman society had never seen an emperor attempt to marry a male slave. The legal, political, and social implications were enormous, but Nero saw himself as above such concerns. He was, after all, practically a god in his own mind. His first step was drastic and irreversible. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, surgically altered to better fit the role he'd been chosen for. This procedure in 66 AD was extremely dangerous. Without modern medicine, anesthesia, or antibiotics, many didn't survive. Ancient sources suggest Nero offered enormous rewards to any physician or surgeon who could perform the operation successfully and perhaps even transform Sporus more completely into a woman. Since this was impossible with first-century medical knowledge, The castration was as far as the transformation could go physically. Remarkably, Sporus survived the dangerous procedure. What followed was a period of recovery and training that ancient historians can only hint at. He had to learn not just to walk and dress as a Roman empress, but to embody Poppaea Sabina herself. Think about what this meant: learning her mannerisms, wearing her clothes and jewellery, responding to her name. Sporus was being asked to become a living ghost, to resurrect someone who could never truly return. The psychological impact of this transformation is difficult to imagine. Roman society had complex attitudes toward gender and relationships, but what Nero was demanding went far beyond anything in their cultural framework. Sporus was being forced to live as someone else entirely, in the most public way possible, yet he adapted because the alternative was likely death. In Nero's Rome, refusing the emperor's wishes wasn't really an option, especially for a slave with no legal protections or powerful advocates. When Nero felt Sporus was ready, he announced his intention to marry him. This wasn't a private ceremony or a quiet arrangement. It was a full imperial wedding with all the traditional Roman ceremonies. According to the historian Suetonius, the wedding included everything a legitimate Roman marriage would have: a dowry, a bridal veil, and all the usual pageantry. Sporus was dressed in the regalia of a Roman empress, complete with the jewellery and clothing that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. The ceremony was attended by crowds of Roman citizens and officials who watched in stunned silence as their emperor married a castrated slave boy. The very foundations of Roman tradition were being challenged before their eyes. Nero didn't just go through the motions, he treated this as a completely legitimate marriage. He referred to Sporus as his wife, called him by Poppaea's name, and expected everyone in the court to treat him as the Empress of Rome. What followed was perhaps even stranger than the wedding itself. Sporus was expected to live as Poppaea Sabina in every way possible. He wore her clothes, slept in her rooms, and accompanied Nero to public events as the Empress. The emperor appointed servants to attend to Sporus, including Calvia Crispinilla as mistress of the wardrobe, a real position that had existed for the actual Poppaea. In Nero's mind, nothing had changed except that his wife had somehow returned to him. But Sporus wasn't passive in this arrangement. Ancient sources hint that he found subtle ways to express his feelings about the situation. The most telling example came in early 68 AD, when he gave Nero a gift that spoke volumes about his state of mind. The gift was a ring adorned with scenes depicting the rape of Persephone, the mythological story of a young woman kidnapped by the god of the underworld and forced to become his queen. The parallel to Sporus's own situation was unmistakable. This wasn't a romantic gesture between loving spouses. It was a carefully chosen symbol that communicated what Sporus couldn't say, that he saw himself as a victim, kidnapped and forced into a role he never chose. The fact that Nero accepted this gift suggests either that he didn't understand its meaning, or that he was so lost in his own delusion that he couldn't see the message Sporus was sending. Either way, it reveals the complex psychological dynamic between the emperor and his unwilling empress. While Nero was focused on his domestic arrangements, the Roman Empire was beginning to show serious cracks. His extravagant spending, neglect of military matters, and increasingly erratic behaviour were creating problems throughout the provinces. In 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, rebelled against Nero's tax policies. This wasn't just a local uprising, it was the beginning of a movement that would eventually topple the emperor. Other provincial governors began to question Nero's leadership. The Roman people, who had once cheered their emperor's performances, were growing tired of his excesses. The Senate, already uncomfortable with his unconventional marriage, saw an opportunity to act against him. But Nero seemed oblivious to these mounting threats. He was too absorbed in his personal world, too convinced of his own divine status to recognize that his empire was slipping away. As rebellions spread through the provinces, life in the imperial palace took on an increasingly surreal quality. Nero continued to treat Sporus as his beloved wife, apparently believing that his elaborate fantasy could somehow become reality through sheer force of will. Ancient sources suggest that some of Nero's advisors tried to warn him about the growing political crisis, but their concerns seemed secondary to his personal obsessions. The emperor, who had once been beloved by the Roman people, was becoming increasingly isolated from political reality. Sporus, meanwhile, found himself at the centre of a collapsing empire. As Nero's empress, he was tied to the emperor's fate in ways he couldn't control. Whatever happened to Nero would inevitably affect him as well. The relationship between emperor and empress had become a symbol of everything wrong with Nero's reign: the disconnect from reality, the abuse of power, the elevation of personal desire over public responsibility. By the spring of 68 AD, multiple provincial governors had declared their opposition to Nero. Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain had been proclaimed emperor by his troops. The Praetorian Guard in Rome was wavering in their loyalty. The Senate was meeting in secret sessions. Yet Nero seemed more concerned with his domestic life than with saving his empire. Ancient historians record that he spent his time planning performances and managing his household, rather than addressing the rebellion that threatened to destroy him. This wasn't just political incompetence, it was a complete break from reality. The man who had once understood how to win the love of the Roman people had lost all connection to the world outside his palace walls. For Sporus, this growing crisis presented both danger and possibility. As long as Nero remained emperor, he would be trapped in his role as replacement empress. But if the emperor fell, what would happen to the young man who had been forced to become someone else entirely? As Chapter 2 ends, we see an empire on the brink of collapse and a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. Sporus has survived the physical transformation Nero demanded, adapted to life as an unwilling empress, and found subtle ways to express his true feelings about his situation. But the political storm gathering around them will soon make personal concerns secondary to basic survival. The rebellion against Nero is gaining momentum, and when it finally reaches Rome, everyone connected to the emperor will be in mortal danger. The strange marriage that shocked the ancient world is about to be tested by forces much larger than one man's grief-driven obsession. And Sporus, who has already been forced to become someone else once, will soon discover that his transformation is far from over. Coming up in Chapter 3, the empire collapses, Nero flees Rome, and Sporus faces a series of new masters as the political world explodes around him. By the summer of 68 AD, Nero's world was collapsing faster than anyone could have predicted. What had started as provincial tax rebellions had become a full-scale revolution against his rule. Servius Sulpicius Galba had been declared emperor by his troops in Spain, and other governors were joining the uprising. Most critically, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, were wavering in their loyalty. When your own bodyguards start questioning whether you deserve their protection, you know the end is near. The Roman Senate, which had tolerated Nero's excesses for years, finally saw their opportunity. In a secret session, they declared Nero an enemy of the state, a death sentence that meant he could be executed on sight if captured. For Sporus, who had been living in the strange bubble of imperial palace life, this political earthquake changed everything. His fate was now tied to a falling emperor with nowhere left to run. When Nero finally grasped the severity of his situation, his response was characteristically dramatic. Rather than try to rally his remaining supporters or negotiate with the rebels, he decided to flee Rome entirely. On June 9, 68 AD, the emperor who had once commanded legions across 3 continents left his palace with only a handful of loyal freedmen. Among them was Sporus, still dressed in the regalia of an empress, still playing the role Nero had forced upon him. They headed for a villa owned by Phaon, one of Nero's freedmen, located about 4 miles outside the city. It wasn't much of a safe house, just a modest country estate where a desperate emperor could hide while deciding what to do next. The journey itself was surreal. Here was the man who had believed himself equal to the gods, sneaking through the countryside in disguise, accompanied by his castrated wife and a few terrified servants. The contrast between Nero's former glory and his current desperation was almost impossible to believe. At Phaon's villa, Nero's true character finally emerged. Stripped of his power and facing imminent capture, he revealed himself to be fundamentally weak, a man who had relied on others to handle difficult situations throughout his life. Ancient sources tell us that Nero paced back and forth, muttering his famous words, "What an artist the world is losing!" Even in his final moments, he was more concerned with his artistic legacy than with the lives he'd destroyed, or the empire he'd nearly ruined. When news arrived that the Senate had declared him a public enemy and ordered his execution, Nero knew his time was up. But even then, he couldn't act decisively. He begged his companions to set an example by taking their own lives first, unable to find the courage to face death alone. According to historical accounts, Nero asked Sporus to help him commit suicide. This request reveals something important about their relationship. Despite everything he'd put the young man through, Nero apparently still saw him as his closest companion, but Sporus refused. After years of being forced to comply with Nero's demands, he finally said no to something. The emperor who had transformed him into someone else couldn't command him to participate in his own death. In the end, Nero required assistance even to die. When the sound of approaching soldiers reached the villa, he finally found the desperation needed to act. With help from his private secretary Epaphroditus, he stabbed himself in the neck. The soldiers who found him attempted to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Nero died at age 30, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome for nearly a century. For Sporus, watching Nero's death must have been a complex experience. This was the man who had destroyed his life, forced him into an impossible situation, and treated him as a living doll. Yet Nero's death also meant uncertainty. What would happen to the former emperor's widow now? Sporus quickly learned that Nero's death didn't mean freedom. In the chaotic political situation that followed, he became a valuable prize, a symbol of the fallen emperor's reign that various powerful men wanted to possess. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had helped turn the guard against Nero. Nymphidius saw himself as a potential emperor and apparently believed that taking Nero's Empress as his own wife would legitimize his claim to power. So Sporus found himself in the same impossible situation with a new master. Nymphidius treated him as his wife and continued calling him by Poppaea's name, just as Nero had done. The young man who had hoped Nero's death might end his ordeal discovered that it had only changed the face of his captor. Fortunately for Sporus, Nymphidius's imperial ambitions were short-lived. When he tried to seize power, his own guards turned against him and killed him before he could even leave his house. The would-be emperor's reign lasted only weeks. Next came perhaps the cruelest twist in Sporus' story. Marcus Salvius Otho, who became emperor in the chaotic year of the 4 emperors, took possession of Nero's former wife. The bitter irony was that Otho had been Poppaea Sabina's first husband, the man Nero had forced to divorce her so he could marry her himself. Now, Otho found himself with the person Nero had transformed to replace Poppaea. Ancient sources suggest that Otho was intimate with Sporus, creating a situation so bizarre that even Roman historians struggle to describe it adequately. For Sporus, this must have been psychological torture. He was being treated as a substitute for a woman he physically resembled by the man who had actually been married to her. The layers of identity confusion and emotional manipulation were staggering. But Otho's reign was also brief. He ruled for only 3 months before losing a crucial battle to Vitellius and committing suicide. Once again, Sporus faced an uncertain future as political power shifted around him. Vitellius, the new emperor, had very different plans for Sporus. Unlike his predecessors who had treated him as a wife or consort, Vitellius saw him as a symbol of the previous regime's decadence, something to be publicly mocked and destroyed. Vitellius ordered that Sporus be forced to participate in a gladiatorial show, specifically reenacting the rape of Proserpina, the same mythological scene depicted on the ring Sporus had given to Nero years earlier. The symbolism was intentional and cruel. The young man would be forced to publicly dramatize his own victimization. This wasn't just entertainment. It was meant to be Sporus' execution carried out as a public spectacle. The reenactment would involve actual violence and assault, ending in his death before thousands of spectators. After years of being passed between emperors like a piece of property, forced to live as someone he wasn't, and enduring psychological and physical abuse, Sporus faced one final humiliation designed to destroy him completely. Faced with this ultimate degradation, Sporus made the only decision that remained truly his own. Rather than submit to Vitellius' sadistic plan, he chose to end his life on his own terms. Ancient sources don't provide details about how he died, only that he committed suicide to avoid the public humiliation that Vitellius had planned. He was approximately 20 years old, still young by any measure, but he had lived through experiences that would have broken many adults. In his final act, Sporus reclaimed something that had been taken from him years earlier, the right to make his own choices. After being transformed, renamed, married off, and passed between masters like property, he finally asserted control over his own fate. His death marked the end of one of history's strangest and most tragic stories, the tale of a young person whose only crime was resembling a dead empress, and whose life became a casualty of one emperor's inability to accept loss and others' desire to possess symbols of power. Sporus' death came during one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history. The year of the 4 emperors saw Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian claim the imperial throne in rapid succession. Each transition brought violence, uncertainty, and massive political upheaval. In this context, Sporus' story becomes even more poignant. He was a victim not just of individual cruelty, but of a system that treated people as objects to be owned, traded, and discarded based on the whims of those in power. The rapid succession of emperors who claimed him demonstrates how little his humanity mattered to the powerful men who controlled his fate. He was valued only for what he represented, never for who he was as a person. Sporus left no writings, no speeches, no direct testimony about his experiences. We know his story only through the accounts of Roman historians who are more interested in the emperors who owned him than in his own perspective. Yet his story has resonated through history precisely because it represents something universal about the abuse of power and the cost of being caught in the orbit of dangerous people. His transformation from anonymous slave to unwilling empress to victim of political chaos illustrates how quickly lives can be destroyed by forces beyond individual control. Ancient historians treated his story as evidence of Nero's depravity and the decadence of imperial Rome. Modern readers might see it differently, as the story of a young person who survived impossible circumstances with a remarkable resilience, only to be destroyed by a system that never saw him as fully human. The tale of Sporus and Nero reveals uncomfortable truths about power, identity, and survival that remain relevant today. It shows how those in positions of authority can reshape others' lives to serve their own psychological needs, regardless of the human cost. It also demonstrates the ways people can maintain dignity and agency even in the most constrained circumstances. Sporus' gift of the Persephone ring and his final choice to die rather than be publicly humiliated show that even victims of extreme abuse can find ways to assert their humanity. Perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that behind every historical account of political intrigue and imperial excess were real people whose lives were forever changed by events they never chose to be part of. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important story from ancient Rome. If you found this exploration of history meaningful, please consider subscribing to more deep dives into the human stories behind historical events. And remember, behind every historical account are real people whose experiences shaped the world we inherited.